Welcome everyone. I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. So thank you all for joining to this Stride webinar. My name is Eleni. I'm an assistant professor in transportation engineering at North Carolina State University. And today I'm going to talk to you about my work with my PhD student on active travel and low-income populations in the US. And this research, as well as the next two presenters' research, was funded by STRIDE, the 2016 USDOT Region 4 University Transportation Center. And please go ahead and type your questions while the presentations are going, and we're going to get to those at the end. Okay, so a little bit about our work and the motivation. So the US is a car-dependent country, and for most households, having a vehicle is considered essential. But what does that mean for low-income households? So for some of them, it means that they cannot afford a vehicle, and this is becoming very important with the poverty suburbanization trends that we see in the last decades, and knowing that in suburbs, accessing any opportunities by walking, cycling, or transit is very difficult. But there is also low-income households that own vehicles, and researchers have been talking about forced ownerships and the financial hardship that these households are experiencing, and the other needs they have to give up to be able to afford vehicle ownership. So this had made us wonder whether the use of active travel, such as walking and cycling, is disproportionate for low-income households because of lack of other options. So with this research, we wanted to gain a better understanding of this use of active travel, and specifically walking and cycling, by low-income carless and low-income car-owning households, compared to higher income households. We were also wanted to understand how this use have been changing over time and how it varies in urban, suburban, and rural areas. So to do that, we used the data from the last 3 national household travel surveys. And this is a little bit of like the framework of our econometric analysis. We did a lot of descriptive analysis with the data, but we also used models to be able to control for other factors and see if the differences we find in the use of active travel are because of the household type and not for other reasons. So we used federal poverty thresholds, and we applied those to the incomes and the household sizes from the different national household travel databases, and those gave us this classification of households that I talked about. So low-income carless, low-income with cars, and higher income. And the higher income are a mix of carless and car owning, but pretty much 98% of them own cars. So it's households on higher income and cars. Something to clarify: our low-income households are at twice the limit of the poverty threshold, so not at the poverty threshold. And so we developed zero-inflated negative binomial models to explain the frequency of walking and cycling for these households, including differences between urban, suburban, and rural areas, and differences over time. Why zero-inflated models? Well, you can imagine that a lot of households may be in that zero category, especially for cycling, right? So that inflates the number of zeros in our data set, and we had to take that into account. So a bit on how our sample is and how our categories are set up. So you see here the 3 household categories at the top, and the percentages of these households in the different data sets. In parentheses, you will see the weighted proportion of these households for the data sets. And this is a national survey, so the weighted proportions are reflecting the US population. So about 6% of our population falls into the low-income carless category, then about 27% for the car-owning low-income, and around 67% on that higher income. You can also see here the vehicles per adult in these household categories, and also how they're split spatially between urban, suburban, and rural areas. For example, most of the higher income households are located in the suburban areas, versus for the low income car owning, most of them are in rural areas. We can also see the differences in the characteristics of the household members. And we see, as we're moving from left to right in our categories, the percent of people employed increases, the percent of people with driver license increases, and the percent of people with a medical condition that makes it difficult for them to move in, get out of, travel outside the house decreases. Okay, so we're going to start a little bit with some overall changes we've found. So we're going to forget for a second our household categories, and we're going to look at active travel in the US over time. So based on our model results, we see a significant increase in walking and cycling, but a much higher increase in walking compared to cycling over the last 15 years. Why could that be? Well, of course, there has been investments in cycling and walking infrastructure over time. There's also a higher awareness of the health benefits of active travel, as well as the environmental benefits. Again, forgetting for a second our household categories and looking at overall variation in space. As we know in urban areas, and our models confirm that walking and cycling is used at a much higher frequency compared to suburban and rural. For suburban areas, we saw higher frequency of cycling compared to rural areas, and that could be because there's also a higher availability of cycling infrastructure in suburban areas. Okay, so let's start with the low-income carless households and what did we find about those, and look at some descriptives first. So this is a table that has the number of walking trips in a week and the average for a household member belonging in these three categories, and we see them over time, so from 2001 to 2017, and for three spatial areas, so urban, suburban, and rural. So what we see is that overall, the low-income carless have been having higher numbers, highest of the three usually, of walking. We don't see cycling, but it does hold for cycling too. And especially this is more pronounced for suburban areas. When we look at mode split, we see them using walking in 2 to 4 times higher proportion of trips compared to other households. So what I have circled is the proportion of trips that happen by walking over time for the low-income carless, and you see that these proportions are much smaller for the other households. You also see that these carless households do use cars, and that has been studied by a few studies, but it's because of their social network. They don't actually own these cars based on the survey data we have. We see walking and cycling being used for shopping and work a lot more than in other categories. And when we're looking at our model results, we find that, first of all, these households are much less likely to be rare users of active travel or never using active travel. They are also making many more walking and cycling trips. For example, in the case of walking, they have about 30% more walking trips per week compared to higher income. And because we control for other factors like age, gender, mobility, conditions, and a lot of fixed effects to capture unobserved variation at the state level or over time and space, we do attribute these differences on their economic status and their lack of other options. So, and as I said before, the models were also showing that suburban areas, the differences are even higher. When some other things that we noticed was a very high drop in car use, even though, again, carless, right? But they do use cars for some trips. So, but there was a very large drop in car use in suburban and rural areas over time, and a very high increase in active travel also over time. So when we're thinking about that, we're also thinking that could be related to increasing gas prices and vehicle-related costs over time that, again, are increasing the reliance of these households on walking and cycling because of lack of other options. Okay, so what about the low-income car owning? We wanted to study those separately because of what other researchers have revealed with these households basically be struggling with car ownership. So even for them having cars, they still don't behave the same as our higher income households. They have more walking trips and more cycling trips and an even higher reliance for suburban and rural areas, where in many cases it doesn't make sense to use cycling and walking to access destinations. So what we overall find here is that even for these households, they are resorting to active travel and due to financial constraints. Okay, so our policy implications based on these results. We have seen evidence that, for example, cycling infrastructure is happening in higher proportions in higher income neighborhoods. But if we think what we found here is that actually it would be the low income households that would be making more use of future improvements, and that would make their trips safer. And another thing I wanted to emphasize here is that with the behavior we find from low income households basically relying on active travel more due to lack of other options, and knowing actually the latest National Household Travel Survey directly asked if active travel is viewed as a way to reduce financial burden, and that is the case for many of those low-income households. We wanted to highlight the importance of investing in transit and investing in first and last mile solutions to for low-income households and improving transportation equity in that sense. So with that, I'm going to conclude my presentation, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so the next presenter can take over. Thank you.
If you can unmute yourself, please.
Sorry. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Adib. I will be presenting about older adults' inclination toward ride sourcing. I work with my Ph.D. supervisor, Dr. Jin, on this project. And so here is the layout for the presentation today. I will talk about some of the background for this work, and I will then present data and methodology used in this study, and followed by major findings from the analysis. And after that, I will present the overall summary of this study, and finally talk about the major implications. The background. There is an increasing number of older adults in the United States. According to the United States Census, people age 65 and above increased by more than 13 million in the past decade and projected to be over 80 million by 2040. And driving ability is significantly affected by aging, as with aging, people's cognitive and physical functions decline. And as a consequence of declining driving abilities over time, older adults are forced to reduce or stop driving. And the driving cessation in elderly individuals seems to contribute to various health consequences and social issues, eventually lead to reduced life expectancy. However, to meet their mobility demand, older adults have to drive even if they don't have the ability to drive, which makes them vulnerable to motor vehicle crashes. And older adults are also at risk of having unmet transportation demand. Therefore, it is critical to offer transportation alternative for them that provide flexible accessibility and comfort. Literature suggests that ride sourcing services have the potential to meet the mobility needs of older adults, providing flexible and independent. However, the unfamiliarity with technologies, insufficient knowledge about how ride sourcing services operate, and concern about pricing system might present challenges for them to use these services. In this regard, understanding the travel behavior of older people and their attitude toward emerging mobility services is critical to examine the potential of ride sourcing services as an effective alternative transportation mode for them. Therefore, the main objective of this study was to examine decision of to switch to ride sourcing services made by the older adults based on monthly cost savings, and explore which factors like the socioeconomic and demographic characteristics and their attitude may influence their decision. So the data used in this study, we obtained that data from an online stated preference survey conducted in 2017. This survey was conducted in 10 major metropolitan areas that are geographically located throughout the nation and in the state of Florida. The metropolitan areas were selected based on the 2010 census core-based statistical area profile, considering their sizes and geographic location as presented in this figure. We adopted the stratified sampling approach to ensure sample representativeness based on age, gender, ethnicity, education, and household income. The survey collected personal and household characteristics, mobility profile, attributes, and their attitudinal preferences. After cleaning the dataset, the final dataset obtained information for around 1,200 respondents, while younger is around 1,000, and the older age respondents were 181. And to understand how attitudes may play a role in respondents' decision to adopt ride sourcing services, the respondents were also asked about their preferences for lifestyle and mobility options, the benefits and concern of ride sourcing services, and reasons of private vehicle ownership. Focusing on the general mobility preference, compared to the younger age group, older adults were less likely to use technologies and the mobility application. For example, if we see these two figures that present younger and older adults mobility preferences, we can see that more than 65% of the younger group agree or strongly agree that they regularly use smartphone applications, while less than 30% of the older adults stated that, and fewer older adults preferred multitasking when they travel. And compared to the younger adults, older adults were less likely to choose the cheapest travel mode. And another interesting thing is that more than 80% of the respondents from both age group, more than 80% of the both age group believe that traveling by themselves was more convenient. Regarding the benefits of shared mobility services, both groups showed similar patterns, like the cost effectiveness and less driving stress were ranked as the top benefit for both age groups. On-demand service was more likely to be valued by older adults compared to the younger adults. And about the concern of shared mobility services, here both age groups, for both age groups, data privacy and unreasonable fare showed bipolar effect. A significant portion of the respondents did not care about these issues at all. They stated no priority, while another significant portion ranked them as the highest priority. This indicates mixed perception in the population regarding data privacy and fair issues of shared mobility service. About the personal vehicle ownership decisions, both age groups here also showed similar patterns. For both age groups, convenience and reliability are the top reasons for owning a vehicle. On the other hand, affordability was the top reason for not owning a vehicle for both age groups. Operation and maintenance cost was another top reason for younger adults for not having a personal vehicle, while fewer or shorter trip distance traveled by older adults were important reasons for not owning vehicle for the older adults. To convert this large number of correlated attitudinal statements, we applied an exploratory factor analysis which convert those correlated parameters into uncorrelated parameters. And the separate factor analysis was performed for each attitudinal aspect, in which the eigenvalues was used as the metric to identify the number of factors. And the eigenvalues reflect how much the variance of the parameter is explained by a factor. And any factor that have eigenvalue more than one can explain more variance than an individual statement. This table presents the identified factors and the brief description of this factor. A total of 14 latent attitudinal factors were identified from those attitudinal statements. And to understand the economic motivation to adopt right sourcing, the respondents were presented with the following valuation question. We fixed a 1 month period and asked about their required saving on monthly basis. This is expected to provide a clear picture of a long-term or permanent replacement of private ownership to the respondents. As shown in this figure, older adults were more likely to require higher cost savings to switch to right sourcing services compared to the younger group. Specifically, if we can see in the figure that 21% of the older adults needed monthly cost savings of $250 or more to give up private vehicles compared to 13% of the younger group. So to reflect the ordered nature of the dependent variable, an ordered logic model was applied to estimate right sourcing adoption, and the cost savings from lower to higher was coded from 1 to 5, which is the latent variables of the utility function. And in addition, to examine the potential heterogeneity in the impacts of the independent variable, we added the random parameters. Besides, the potential source of the heterogeneity was also determined by introducing the interaction effect into the model. In this regard, random parameters are interacted with various socioeconomic and demographic attributes to identify the sources of the variation of the random parameters. Moving on to the model results. So we developed a separate random parameter ordered logic model for older adults and younger adults, which provides a means to examine whether and how their decision in switching to right sourcing services may differ, and the result is presented in this table. So the several attitudinal factors, socioeconomic and demographic characteristics are found significantly associated with the decisions of right sourcing adoption for both age groups. About the potential heterogeneity test in the impact of attitude, tech savviness, and the rational choice showed random effect, implying that the presence of heterogeneity among the older adults. Here, the negative mean of the two random parameters indicate that, on average, those who are more focused on service quality, like travel cost, travel time, in their mobility decision, and those who are more tech-savvy were easier to convince to switch to right sourcing with less economic incentive compared to those who are not. And the interaction effect showed the potential sources of heterogeneity. The result showed that two variables had significant interaction effect. It showed that rational users with high income required higher cost saving to change their mobility preferences to right sourcing, and the tech-savvy people who valued the cost effectiveness of shared mobility also needed higher economic incentives. To further facilitate the interpretation of the impact of the influential variables, we calculated marginal effects and direct elasticities. This figure shows the marginal effect and direct elasticities for cost savings of $50 per month. We can produce like similar graph for the other cost saving categories. We use the lowest cost saving categories to demonstrate the relative impact among the influential factors. Like a monthly cost savings of $50 represent those who are the easiest to persuade to adopt right sourcing. And the positive effects here reflect factors that help motivate the switch to right sourcing, while negative effects reflect factors that hinder the switches. One interesting observation from this figure is that while younger adult decisions were highly influenced by the demographic attributes, older adult choices to switch to right sourcing were mostly affected by their attitudes. Like private vehicle utility and trust issue with strangers had negative impact for both young and older adults, but the effect on older adults was much larger than that on younger adults. Tech savvy and cost effectiveness showed larger positive impact for older adults, but had no impact for younger adults. Specifically, older adults that were more technology embracing were more likely to switch to right sourcing with lower economic incentives. And those who consider travel costs as the main reason for vehicle ownership decision were also easier to persuade to the switch with less economic incentives. So education level was the dominant personal attribute that contribute to older adult decisions, where high school graduates were easier to switch to right sourcing services from their existing mode. So in summary, socioeconomic and demographic attributes highly impacted younger adults more decisions, while the older adults For older adults, the choice to switch to ride sourcing was mainly affected by their attitude. And older adults who had concern about traveling with strangers or believed that private mobility provide better utilities in terms of convenience, reliability, and flexibility required higher cost-saving incentive to switch to ride sourcing services. Although both groups had similar attitude toward joy of driving, the pro-driving attitude was not a decisive factor for older adults. This may indicate that ride sourcing does stand a chance to break the attachment with private vehicles for older adults if it provides the same or even the better utilities as private vehicles. Older adults who were rational choice users or for whom cost was the main factor when making mobility choice, less economic incentives were needed to encourage the switch to ride sourcing. This indicates the potential market for ride sourcing among older adults who would value the mobility option that could provide faster, cheaper, and functional services that suit their traveling needs. And older adults who are tech savvy also required less economic motivation to switch from their existing mode to ride sourcing, and their concern on unreasonable fares or complicated service request procedure did not impact older adults' decision on ride sourcing adoption. Moving on to the major implication, ride sourcing services for older adults may focus on the service quality, especially privacy, reliability, convenience, and flexibility. Additional measures ensuring security, privacy, and driver selection would also be beneficial. Outreach programs that highlight the above mentioned features of the ride sourcing services as well as free trial programs would be more helpful in encouraging older adults to use ride sourcing. And again, these outreach and trial programs may help travelers realize the benefit and advantages of ride sourcing services in terms of reducing travel time and travel cost and improving convenience like door-to-door services, therefore encouraging the adoption and use of ride sourcing among older adults. An educational campaign focusing on introducing the operation, process, communication, and level of efforts involved in using ride sourcing services could help those who are less tech savvy to get familiar and comfortable with these services. And that's all my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for inviting us to give this talk. And I am excited to share our work as part of the STRIDE project. Our disadvantaged population was just rural communities, and we were looking at the opportunity of mobility as a service, or MaaS. You may know that acronym. And the idea here is that we have opportunities where it's car share, ride share, things like bike and scooter share, and you can sometimes even include transit as part of mobility as a service, depending on your definition. So I worked on this. I'm Jeff LaMondia at Auburn University, and had two excellent students that helped with this too, Mitch Fisher and Jacob McGee. So our motivation for this project had to do with the fact that we talk a lot about mobility as a service in urban areas, but not so much in rural areas. And we really wanted to understand if it was going to work, how much it's currently being used, and all these different components that are impacting those decisions. And rural communities are very different from their urban counterparts that we know much more about. We have much more dispersed geographies. People are more spread out, both in the land development, but also where the populations are. We had further separation between where people live and where they work and do fun things, those leisure activities. And lastly, there's a lot of differences in population demographics when you jump from an urban core into a rural core. Much more wide gaps between, say, things like income and ages. And so the previous research on mobility as a service, especially in those urban areas, has told us a lot about trip distance being probably the most important factor for adoption. So that was a real important factor guiding our work, which led us to our two objectives. The first is really trying to determine the relative influence of household and trip characteristics on our mobility as a service mode choices in rural areas and document how they differ from urban areas. And then once we figured out kind of the mode choice aspect, we dug in a little bit further to look at how the relative influence of household and trip characteristics impacted those trip distances of how people were traveling with mobility as a service modes in rural areas, especially compared to their urban counterparts. So our data for this, we started off trying to collect this during COVID, which we all know is not going to give us good data. So we went back to the 2017 National Household Travel Survey. And in this, we cleaned a lot of the data, got rid of things that didn't make sense, and excluded a lot of the extreme outlier information. So we did an outlier analysis, especially on trip distances. And we were left with still a very large data set for our rural households and our comparison, the urban households as well. In this work, we know for sure we have some mobility as a service modes. Those are listed as the taxi or Uber or Lyft category, as well as the rental car or car sharing category. But we also like to think that paratransit, especially in rural areas, operates in the same capacity. So people are using paratransit modes. If you're not familiar with paratransit, that's more of the dial-a-ride or a scheduled service for a transit vehicle to pick you up at your home and deliver you to whatever destination you need to get to. And you can see here the basic characteristics of percentage of trips happening by mode and also the mean distances of those trips are dramatically different between urban and rural areas. So we know starting off that there are some major differences that we need to recognize, which leads us to this figure here. What we've done here in this is looking exclusively at the rural trips, and these are non-personal vehicle trips. So everything outside personal vehicle. If you wanted to include personal vehicle, all of these would be such small percentages that it would be very hard to talk about. And you'll see also that they're broken up. These are trips, the total number of trips by purpose and distance traveled in these different categories. The less than 6 miles is its own separate y-axis, and that's because it's so much bigger than the rest of them. So we know that in rural areas, there is a lot of walking and biking trips going on for these very short distances, which is great for mobility as a service. Not so great when we are trying to pull people away from active modes, but there are these trips that need to be completed and are happening in a much bigger scale than everything else. And then as we move into longer trips, they incorporate mobility as a service in these rural areas, which is really exciting to see it. They are small percentages in general, but they are being used, which is great. Overall, that 6 to 15 mile distance, which we see in urban areas as kind of the sweet spot, is also true here. And again, shopping, errands, social recreation, and a little bit of work are all utilizing these mobility as a service modes. Now, it's also really interesting in rural, which is not the same as urban. So when we get into those 50+ mile trips, we're seeing that car share and the rental cars and things like that are being really important modes for these trips. And something that we can maybe tap into and unique for this geography. We did a lot of analysis looking at rural and urban by all these different characteristics of household characteristics, trip characteristics, and I'm only going to show a few here to save on time. But the first one that I want to show is this comparison in mode choices. Those are the different colors in our pie charts for different trip purposes in rural and urban areas. And you can see they're actually quite similar between rural and urban, meaning that the motivators between the two might be consistent of what's happening. And across all these different purposes, public transportation actually had a larger mode share in urban areas than rural areas, especially for work trips and healthcare trips. But we see that mobility as a service modes, the car share and ride share options specifically, are also about the same in urban and rural areas, with a little bit more in those urban areas. So we already know there's this knowledge and understanding of how to use mobility as a service in these areas. If we break it up by income, a characteristic of these households, we also looked at burden of transportation costs to your household, had almost identical responses. So we know that that's related to their income. We see here, again, a distribution of mode choices, and the bulk of people using mobility as a service modes is those higher income categories. And that kind of makes sense that if you have disposable income, you're going to be able to afford these additional modes and paying for that additional mobility. Also very interesting in here, in the rural areas, it was the households with the lowest and highest income groups that really focused on personal vehicles. So they were utilizing them in different ways. And one is because they have to, and one is because they choose to. And so those we'll see play into our modeling efforts, which you can see here. We ran two multinomial logit models. The first on the left is your rural, and the one on your right is urban. So we focused on those different mode choices. I don't expect you to be able to read these, but as a good researcher, I have to show you that we ran some models and we had some statistical results for it. I will just summarize what we learned from those results. And what was really interesting is kind of at a core, the themes across rural and urban areas of household characteristics and trip characteristics were very, very similar. That surprised us a lot, that we expected things in the rural areas to be a little bit different, that people perceived things differently, but it was not. What we did find is that in rural areas, the higher incomes, of course, were more likely to use mobility as a service when all other variables are held constant. Healthcare and work trips were more likely to use the paratransit modes, and that was also interesting to us. Possibly leading us to use mobility as a service as a substitute. In rural areas, the further distances that you went, it switched over to really preferring public transportation, which we know is an important connection piece for rural areas to get them, especially to urban hubs. In the East Coast, kind of up and down the entire East Coast, from the Northeast all the way down to the Southeast, there's really less interest overall in mobility as a service modes. When you moved further west, we saw coefficients that indicated there was more likelihood to use those modes. And what was also interesting is we did not see gender, age, ethnicity factors really coming in to affect these mode choices. Again, a real surprise. And I think it has to really tie more into those income values. There was a high correlation between some of those in rural areas. Now, to look at the distance aspect of it and how this is playing into rural areas, we broke it up in terms of all of those trips for rural and urban by distances traveled. And here you can see we broke it up by modes again. And overall, they're pretty similar between rural and urban areas, but definitely across the board, you can see that there's a little peak up in terms of the mean trip distance for rural areas is across the board longer. What's also interesting is that in rural areas, there's a much wider range of distances for all of the modes being used, especially for those longer distance trips. They really stand out. And most important to this probably is the fact that there seem to be these trip distances and mode combinations happening, where walking and cycling is really important to less than 1 mile trips. Personal vehicles and mobility as a service are really around those 6 mile trips. And once we get higher than that, it switches over to a lot of public transportation and personal vehicles. Another one that we'll look at here has to do with trip purposes and how people are taking different types of trip distances by purpose in rural and urban areas. And these figures demonstrate how the rural trips are made for purposes that tend to reach destinations that are further away than urban areas. That's consistent with what we know about rural trips. And so that's good. But when we tie this, actually, we started linking this information with our previous distances traveled by different modes. We can see there's actually a lot of opportunities where mobility as a service can be used to reach a lot of these important destinations and trip purposes. So again, as we saw in the beginning of my presentation, that social and recreational trips kind of have the most opportunity for these mobility as a service modes, we see that that's exactly what's happening here in our trips too. So again, we estimated another model. This was a logarithmic regression on trip distance, and again for rural trips and urban trips. And the results here were actually very different. And again, let's talk about them. You don't need to read the minuscule tiny coefficients in our table. But from the trip distance trends, that there were some similarities, especially when it came to demographics, but rural trips across the board were typically further, almost double the distance when you account for every other variable that was significant in our model. We also see that work and healthcare trips tend to be further distances for rural components compared to their urban counterparts, and other trip purposes as well. Again, interesting compared to the adoption of modes in the southeast of our country, which is actually really appropriate for STRIDE research, that we travel further than any other community in the country to get to all other trip purposes. Really interesting. And finally, that the rural households, of all the demographics that we considered, income was by far the most important. And it was really just that group with high income are the ones that are going to be traveling the furthest distances, and most likely, as we know, going to use mobility as a service for it. So some information, kind of some takeaways for future research and opportunities for implementation. We see a lot of opportunities, that there's already a lot of use for mobility as a service. And when I say a lot, it's relative to the urban areas as well, that there's much more going on than I think has been documented in a lot of the research and reports that are coming out about mobility as a service, that we're finding opportunities here. And we see some very specific opportunities for growth, especially those social recreational trips, shopping and errand trips, the shorter distances. There are so many of them going on in rural communities. We don't really want to eat away thinking about a sustainable community from the walking and biking trips, but people are using their personal vehicles for those and public transit, and those are great opportunities to switch over to a more sustainable mobility as a service mode. And of course, partnering with transit, especially for those longer distances that are happening, would be a great opportunity here for future collaborations and future research. There are, however, a number of significant barriers that we need to worry about. Really, in rural areas, it's expensive relatively for these folks. And so we're only seeing the higher income groups use it. And so if there are ways that we can, again, partnering with public transportation, perhaps subsidize these types of modes, it will provide more opportunities to people. We want to think about the trips that people are making, especially those long distance ones, are infrequent. And with the purposes of healthcare, especially, they're not happening every single day. So we need to worry about kind of the sustainability of a mobility as a service mode, and how is that going to operate and be feasible for folks day in, day out. We actually are doing some research right now through STRIDE, looking at latent trips in these areas to say, okay, what if we start offering more of these modes? Is that going to tap into an unmet demand for these long distance trips to get to urban areas? And we're seeing that, kind of spoiler alert for that research, that yes, there is an opportunity that could be built up with these modes. And then lastly, this idea of long distance trips, I think in some aspects, partnering with public transportation will be a great opportunity, but that's a lot of work. And just throwing mobility as a service at people and saying, hey, use it for that trip, is probably not going to be successful in the short term. So those are my my final thoughts here. And I am, I guess, in charge of the questions and survey for everybody. If you have questions, please feel free to use the Q&A chat box that's part of our webinar here. You can also use the chat function. I'll call out the questions and throw them to Adib and Eleni. If you have specific things that you want to make sure that we call it to the right person, please do. And we also have this list of upcoming webinars that are happening through STRIDE. And there's an important survey to take. It's very short, less than a minute, to kind of give us feedback on the webinar series. So let me pull up some of these questions. Adib and Eleni, if you want to come back and join us, that would be great. Okay, so Let's see. Oh, we've got a couple here. First, says for income-based, oh, Eleni, this one's going to be for you on bicycle and pedestrian facilities. So for income-based mode choice, was there any query or measure for latent demand due to the lack or minimal availability of bicycle and pedestrian facilities?
So that's a really great question. So we were not able to capture that, and we actually we did not model mode choice. Our descriptive analysis discussed a little bit about mode split, but we primarily focused on the frequency of bicycle and walking trips. So we were not able to capture that. But yeah, that's a great point.
Excellent. Let's see. Adib, I think the next one is up for you. It's an aging driver comment. Many of us have. Sorry?
Yeah, go. Yeah.
Okay. Many of us have had to take the keys away from elderly relatives because of crashes and near misses, which have demonstrated a diminishment of driver competency. So I guess, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah. Thank you. That's a nice point. Yeah, that's one of the reasons like people lose their driving ability.
Great. This one's for me. The graph showing different modes by distance for rural areas had public transportation and paratransit as separate categories on the charts. Aren't both the same? Or did you separate paratransit from fixed route service? Thanks for the clarification. Yes, they in many cases operate under the same banner. We separated them out on purpose because their operations are a little bit different. And yes, when I referred to public transportation, that was a fixed route transit service versus the paratransit, which is more of the dial-a-ride or getting you from a very specific origin to a very specific destination, which we thought was more relevant to a discussion of mobility as a service where it was more individualized, but an excellent observation. Yeah. Next, should internet and social media access for shopping, information, and interpersonal communication be considered as a travel mode or impacting mode choice? Adib, do you want to answer that? I feel like that's both you and I.
Oh, so
maybe not. I can just jump in. I think
maybe.
it's a really good question. And especially now post-COVID, when we're doing so many things remotely, it absolutely should be a consideration of an at-home activity for these replaced trips completely. We did not include it in our analysis, but it would have been a great one to include, especially, as I mentioned, healthcare quite a bit. And a lot of rural areas are starting to do this remote healthcare where you can Zoom with a doctor or nurse practitioner. And it's an important piece of this connectivity for rural areas. An excellent point. And then one last question. I'm monopolizing these. I'm sorry, guys. Was there any, this one's for me, is there any data collected for people who used multimodal transportation, such as biking to get to transit? Also a great point. In our data analysis, we simplified to the longest leg of their trip. So if they, whatever their access mode to public transportation was, we just counted it as public transportation if that was the biggest mode. Yeah, there you go. Any other questions? I see there's also one here that's kind of for everybody. Thanks for the presentation. It's fascinating research. Is there any report or published paper on what you presented here today?
So what I presented today specifically is under review. I'm happy to, you're welcome to email me. I'm happy to send you the manuscript, and hopefully it will be out soon. But yeah, as Ondine also mentioned in that question, the final report. She added the final report for her project. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I gave you the link for the paper that I published on this study.
Great, very good. And I can say that ours is under review as well. So, and again, if you would like a draft or most of it's actually from the final report. So if you have access to that, you have a lot of our work as well. Are there any final questions? Well, thanks very much, everyone. I think we'll wrap it up here. And if you have any further follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. And as Eleni and Undine mentioned, our final report is posted in the chat for you to check out. Thank you so much. Undine, is there anything more we need to do?
Nope, you did a great job. Thank you all so much. This is a really fantastic webinar, and we'll be sending a recording out within the next few days.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thank you.